Hello everyone. Today I'm very excited to be sharing with you my new dress pattern, which is called the Damsel dress. This dress features a fitted bodice with a basque waist in the front and off the shoulder sleeves finished with elastic. The full skirt is completely gathered around the waist and can be made in 3 lengths: above the knee, T-length, or floor length. The dress can also be made with or without boning. Now, I think this is a very romantic dress, and depending on the trim and fabric that you choose, it can work for a variety of occasions and parties. Now, this pattern is available as a downloadable PDF in my Etsy shop, so feel free to check it out if you'd like to follow along. But otherwise, I'm very excited to share my process with you, so let's get into it. Now for my red dress, the materials I will use are about 7 meters of this red faux silk fabric with a width of about 140 centimeters. I'm going to use this fabric for both the dress and the lining, but you may wish to make your lining from a different fabric. I will also be using 1 meter of plain cotton fabric to interline my bodice. However, you may prefer to use proper interfacing. I will also be using one 50 centimeter red zipper and matching red thread, as well as 1.5 meters of elastic for the shoulders and sleeves, and my elastic is about 1 centimeter wide, and 2.5 meters of red braided trim, which is also 1 centimeter wide, which I'm going to use for the neckline and the waistline. Now for my red dress, I'm going to be skipping the boning, but I will quickly cover how to add it if you want boning for extra support. And other materials you may wish to consider: 1 meter of a different fabric for lining, 1 meter of interfacing, 1.5 meters of boning, like featherweight boning, wriggling, or even zip ties, 1 package of bias tape for boning casing, 1 hook and eye for the top of the zipper, and other trims, laces, or decorative elements. I'm going to start by getting my pattern ready. First, I select the pattern I want to print. I'm going to print the A4 bodice and sleeves PDF and the A4 skirt PDF. When printing, I want to make sure I am printing on the correct corresponding paper size, A4 or US letter. I also want to make sure that my scale is set to 100%, and you may need to adjust your printer's margins to 0. Now, the bodice and sleeves pattern are a separate PDF from the skirt pattern. This is because the skirt is so big. After printing the 2 PDFs, I'm going to check the square in the top left corner of the first page and make sure the dimensions are correct. The dimensions look good to me, so I'm going to trim the page margins as needed, overlap them, and then tape the pages together to create a grid. The grid is what will form the pattern. The PDF for the bodice and sleeves is 24 pages, and it will make a grid that is 6 pages across and 4 pages down for that total of 24 pages. And the PDF for the skirt is 63 pages, and it will make a grid that is 7 pages across and 9 pages down for the total of 63 pages. Again, that skirt is very big. I will work slowly as I match and tape the pages together, doing my best to keep everything aligned. And for the skirt, I like to work row by row when assembling. After assembling, I then cut the pattern to my selected size. And I am going to use size 38. This is because the pattern is labeled by the bust size in inches, and I have about a 38-inch bust, so I'm going to use the size labeled 38. After assembling and cutting out my pattern to size, I quickly make a mock-up of the bodice to test the fit. I highly recommend you make a mock-up of the bodice before cutting into your nice dress fabric. Making a mock-up can save you heartbreak, and it's a great chance to fine-tune the fit of the garment. You may want to try sizing up or down, or if your bust is particularly full or small, you might want to look into a full bust adjustment or a small bust adjustment. This is also a great point to check the length of the skirt and make sure it's appropriate for your height and hem choice. I made a mock-up of the bodice and 1 sleeve for a quick check, and I was very happy with the fit, so I continued on. Next, I'm going to lay out all of my pattern pieces on my fabric and then cut them out. I like to start by cutting out my skirt pieces first, especially because my skirt side pieces are so large and they cannot be cut on the fold of the fabric. So after I cut out my skirt front on the fold, I then cut my 2 skirt back pieces. Then I open up my fabric to its full width and I cut out 2 skirt side pieces, making sure they are mirrored when I cut them out. As you can see, I'm cutting 2 large pieces of fabric, opening them up to their full width, stacking them, and then cutting out my 2 large skirt side pieces. Again, making sure that the right sides of the fabric pieces are facing each other so that my skirt side pieces will be mirrored once they are cut out. I want one for the left side and one for the right. And I'm not sure if you can see, but when cutting out my 2 skirt side pieces, I have the fold of the fabric placed where my grain line of the pattern has been marked. So yes, the skirt side pieces are very, very big. After cutting out my skirt pieces, I then cut out my bodice and sleeve pieces. And then I cut out my bodice pieces one more time from my cotton fabric, which I'm going to use as the interlining, a sort of replacement for the interfacing. And here is everything I have cut out. 2 skirt side pieces, 2 skirt back pieces, 1 skirt front cut on the fold, 2 sleeves, 2 sleeve bottom edge casings, 2 sleeve top edge casings, 3 bodice fronts cut on the fold. 2 have been cut from the red faux silk and 1 has been cut from the cotton fabric. 6 bodice side fronts, 4 from the red faux silk and 2 from cotton. 6 bodice side backs, 4 from the red faux silk and 2 from cotton. And 6 bodice backs, 4 from the red faux silk and 2 from cotton. So I have 3 layers for my bodice. 1 layer has been cut from the red faux silk for the outer layer. 1 layer has been cut from the red faux silk for the lining. And 1 layer has been cut from the plain cotton for the interlining layer. And with everything cut out, I can now begin sewing. I'm going to start by applying a layer of cotton to the back of my bodice outer layer pieces. As I mentioned, I have cut 3 layers for my bodice, 1 for the outer layer, 1 for lining, and 1 for interlining. So I'm going to place a layer of cotton on the back of my bodice outer layer pieces and pin these 2 layers together. After pinning thoroughly, I will go around the edges and baste the 2 layers together so that I can then treat them as 1 layer. Now you can baste by hand or by machine. Basting by hand may give you a little more control and help ensure that the layers are smooth against one another. But of course, basting with the machine is much quicker. Just take care and work slowly around the edges as you baste the 2 layers together. Make sure that you keep your basting within the seam allowance of that 1.5 centimeters so that it's not visible. Also make sure that everything is smooth against one another. After you have basted the 2 layers together, you can then remove the pins. And you will repeat this for all of the bodice pieces. The bodice front, the 2 bodice front sides, 2 bodice back sides, and the 2 bodice back pieces. Now, adding a layer of cotton as interlining is my preferred method, but you may prefer to use interfacing, which can be sewn or ironed for application. Please test any interfacing, especially iron-on interfacing, and make sure it's compatible with your fabric and the iron heat isn't too hot. Be sure to read the directions if you do wish to opt for interfacing instead. And this step isn't exactly mandatory, but I highly recommend it. It will help provide structure and support to the garment and prevent any warping. Here you can see the cotton layer applied to the wrong side of my bodice outer layer pieces. Next, I'm going to match the curved side edges of my bodice front side pieces to my bodice front piece. I'm going to match the bodice front to the bodice side front with the right sides together, and then match and pin along all the edges. After pinning, I stitch the side edges together, working carefully around the curved bust edge and making sure that my basting is within the seam allowance. I like to start from the top and sew downwards. Next, I'm going to clip the seam allowance and press my seam open with an iron to get it to lay nice and flat and look tidy. Now you may wish to simply cut small notches. Think of cutting a small V shape into the seam allowance and then press that seam open. I think cutting notches works very well for convex curves along the bust seam. However, I'm going to cut my seam allowance with my pinking shears and then press the seam open. Next, I'm going to match my bodice back pieces to my bodice back side pieces. I'm going to match the long, straight side edges together with right sides touching and then pin. I want to make sure I am matching the correct sides together. The top edge of the bodice back piece should slant downwards towards the center back. After pinning, I then stitch the bodice back to the bodice side back, again making sure that my basting is within the seam allowance so it's not visible. And after sewing that seam, I trim it with my pinking shears and then I press the seam open with my iron. Now I'm going to match the front half of my bodice to the back half by matching those side edges together with right sides facing one another and then pinning. After pinning, I will then stitch that side seam, making sure that my basting is within the seam allowance. After stitching that side seam and creating the side seam, I then trim the seam allowance with my pinking shears and then press it open. And here is what my bodice is looking like so far. I have sewn the bodice front to the side front and the bodice back to the bodice side back, and then I have sewn the front half of the bodice to the back half at that side seam to create the final side seam. And then I'm going to repeat all of these steps to create my bodice lining. My lining is going to be made out of the same red fabric as my bodice, but you might prefer to make your lining out of a different material. Next, I'm going to briefly go over adding boning to your bodice's lining. For my red dress, I am going to skip the boning, but you may wish to add boning to your dress. Boning can help provide a little extra support and shape, and as a bonus, it can help minimize wrinkles. Now, adding boning isn't required, but it may be a nice addition to your dress. You will see on the pattern bodice side front and bodice side back pattern pieces an area marked in gray for boning. You can use these gray lines and chalk to mark the placement for the boning on your bodice's lining. If you're using featherlight or wriggling, then you can stitch the boning directly into your bodice's lining. Or you can use a single fold bias tape to create boning channels. Simply stitch either side of the bias tape to create the channel and then insert the boning like a zip tie. No matter what, be sure to trim the boning and finish the end so it does not creep into your seam allowance. Adding the boning to the lining is pretty simple, and I like to add it before attaching my lining to my bodice. Once my bodice and lining are finished, I'm going to briefly set them aside while I work on the sleeves. Now the first thing I like to do is add a line of stay stitching to that curved edge on my sleeve. Just a line of stitching on either side right after that little cut out dip on the top edge of the sleeve. Now this is optional, but I feel like adding the stay stitching helps prevent any stretching that could occur when handling the sleeve. And to be upfront, fitting the sleeve's underarm portion into the sleeve hole on the bodice can be tricky. So I like to add stay stitching here to help keep everything tidy and secure, and hopefully it will make it easier to fit the sleeve into the bodice's armhole. After adding stay stitching to both sides, to both sleeves, I am now ready to add the casing to the top and bottom of the sleeve. As you can see, there are two casings, one shorter casing which is for the top edge of the sleeve, and one longer casing which is for the bottom edge of the sleeve. I'm going to match the top casing to the sleeve's top edge with the right side of the casing facing the wrong side of the sleeve. It is a little hard to tell which is the right side and which is the wrong side on my red fabric, but I have marked the right side with a pin. So again, I'm going to have the right side of the casing facing the wrong side of the sleeve, and then I'm going to pin the top casing to the sleeve's top edge, working all along that top curved edge, matching the edges together and pinning. When I get to the end, I trim any excess length of the casing so that it matches and is the same length as the sleeve's top edge. After doing the top edge, I'm going to repeat this and add the bottom casing to the bottom edge of my sleeve. I will match and pin the sleeve's curved bottom edge to the edge of the bottom casing. And again, I want the right side of the bottom casing facing the wrong side of the sleeve. After pinning, I trim any extra length from that bottom casing, and then I'm going to sew these casing edges to the sleeve. Now when I sew the casing to the sleeve, I am going to sew with about 0.6 centimeters of seam allowance, which is about a 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Now the rest of the dress will be sewn with 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance or 5/8 inch of seam allowance. But this portion, where we add the casing to the sleeve's top and bottom edges, will require a much more narrow seam allowance. So take care and make a note and sew the casing with 0.6 centimeters or a 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And afterwards, I did go over those edges with a quick zigzag stitch. And then, just to keep everything tidy, I gave those top and bottom edges a press with an iron, pressing that seam allowance towards the casing. Next, I'm going to fold the raw edge of my casings over 2 times towards the front of the sleeve and then pin it down in place. What I am doing is creating the casing that is going to hold the elastic band for the top and bottom of my sleeve. So basically, you're going to fold the casing up towards the seam we just created to make the casing, and then fold it over a second time at about 0.6 centimeters or a 1/4 inch to hide the raw edge. As you fold your casing, you can pin the folded edge down over top the previous line of stitching to hide that stitching. And as you fold and pin, take care not to twist or warp the casing. Try to keep it even and tidy as you work along the top and bottom edges, folding that casing twice and pinning it in place. You are going to do this for both the sleeve's top edge and the sleeve's bottom edge, folding the casing twice and pinning it over top the previous stitching. And here is how it should look. Afterwards, you can top stitch the casing down in place, and as you stitch, work carefully and slowly, stitching very close to that folded edge. Here you can see the front and back of the casing once it has been added. Next, I'm going to add elastic to these casings I have just sewn. I'm going to cut 4 pieces of elastic in total. 2 pieces will be about 27 centimeters long, and 2 pieces will be about 36 centimeters long, and I will be using elastic that is 1 centimeter wide. I will cut 2 pieces of elastic that are about 27 centimeters long for the top casing, which is for the shoulder. I recommend your elastic be somewhere between 22 to 32 centimeters long. I will also cut 2 pieces of elastic that are 36 centimeters long for the bottom casing, which will go around my upper arm. You can determine your measurement by measuring around your upper arm. And of course, all of this can best be determined and tested with a mock-up. Next, I'm going to use a bobby pin to feed my cut pieces of elastic through the casings or elastic channels. I will use the bobby pin to push and massage the elastic through the casing to the other end. And on either end, I'm going to pin the elastic to secure it, and then I'm going to take it to my machine and stitch it in place. Now, as a quick note, I want to mention an alternative. You could sew up the side seam of your sleeve first and then add the casings and elastic. This slight reordering might be a little bit tricky to work with, but it can give a very tidy finish to the bottom edge and the bottom elastic casing. This is just an alternative if you're up for the challenge. And with the elastic added to the top and bottom of the sleeve, this is how the sleeve is looking. Again, I'm going to stitch the elastic in place to secure it. Right now it's just pinned, but I am going to stitch it. Next, I'm going to clip into the seam allowance of the sleeve. I will cut at the top edge where there's a part that notches up and looks like a corner. It is where your casing and elastic should end. This is the top edge of the sleeve. It is at this point I'm going to clip into the seam allowance just the littlest bit, like less than half a centimeter. The reason for cutting into the sleeve at this point is to help pivot the sleeve when setting it into the armhole. The top edge that is finished with casing and has elastic is going to show when worn, but the portion that is not finished with casing is going to be sewn into the armhole and covered with lining. A small cut at the point between the two will help pivoting and make sewing easier. So I make cuts on either side of the sleeve on both sleeves. Next, I'm going to match the side edges of my sleeve together and pin. I want the right sides of my sleeve facing each other, and I want to make sure that the bottom edge is matched up perfectly. After pinning, I am going to sew the sleeve side edge with 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. After sewing, I trim the seam allowance and then finish it with a zigzag stitch, but you may wish to finish this seam with a different method. With the side seam of my sleeves finished, I can now turn the sleeves right side out and begin setting them into the armhole of my bodice. Now this next bit may seem a little odd or a little confusing, and it can be quite challenging. So my advice is to work slowly, use pins, and hand baste anything if needed. I'm going to take the curved edge of the top of my sleeve and match the portion that has not been finished with the casing and match it into the armhole of my bodice. I start by matching the side seam of my sleeve to the side seam of my bodice and pin these points together. And I want the right sides facing each other. Then working up either side of the armhole, I pin the sleeve in place. Now the sleeve shouldn't go all the way up to the top of the armhole edges. There should be about 1.5 centimeters left on either side for seam allowance. And when reaching the top edge, you are going to pivot the sleeve, pivoting that elastic, that casing, and turning it away from the top edge and pinning in place. This way, when you sew the lining in place, it won't catch the sleeve. Here you can see my sleeve pinned into the armhole of my bodice. You can see I have matched the curved edge without the casing into the armhole. You can also see that the bodice's armhole is a little bit bigger than the sleeve, extending past the sleeve 1.5 centimeters on either side. This is the room left for the seam allowance on either side. And it is at either side I am going to pivot my elastic and casing and then pin it in place. This is because when I add lining, I am going to sew this top and back corner of my bodice, and I don't want my sleeve to get caught. So this is how my sleeve is looking once pinned into the armhole of my bodice. And as a note, now is a great last chance to adjust the elastic in the top casing of your sleeve, pulling it tighter if need be. The next thing I'm going to do is sew my sleeve into the armhole of my bodice. And I'm going to do this very, very carefully using 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. While sewing, take care not to catch the sleeve and make sure it is set smoothly into the armhole. If needed, you can hand baste first and then machine stitch. You will want to make sure that any stay stitching, basting, and the ends of your casing with the elastic have been caught within the seam allowance so that they are hidden. After setting the sleeve into the bodice's armhole, I am next going to add the lining. I'm going to match the right side of the lining facing the right side of the bodice and pin the entire top edge of the lining to the bodice. As I pin, I want to take care and match key points like seams and the center front together. After pinning, I then stitch the lining to the bodice, taking care as I sew over top the armholes, making sure I am not catching the sleeve. I work very slowly and again keep any basting stitching within the seam allowance. And after sewing the lining, I'm next going to clip the seam allowance and trim the corners to make turning easier. After trimming and clipping the seam allowance, I turn the bodice and the lining right side out. Next, I'm going to press the neckline and the armholes with an iron. I want it to get it all lying smooth and flat. I also take a quick moment to understitch the seam allowance to the lining. Understitching may be quite tricky. I was only able to understitch partially, but it does help the neckline lie more flat. And this is how the bodice is looking so far. The next thing I'm going to do is assemble the skirt and then attach it to the bodice. The skirt is made using 3 pattern pieces, and once cut, 5 pieces in total. 1 skirt front cut on the fold, 2 skirt sides, and 2 skirt backs. I will sew the side edges together to assemble the full skirt. First, I'm going to sew up my side seams, joining my skirt front to my 2 skirt side pieces, and then joining my skirt back pieces to my skirt sides. On the pattern, there are gray stars which will help you match up the side edges. Now I'm going to sew the side seams of my skirt using a French seam because I want to hide those raw edges within the seam. However, you are able to finish these seams with another method if you prefer. For example, you could use a zigzag stitch to finish your raw edge or something else entirely. But I am going to use a French seam. So first, I match my skirt front to my skirt side piece all along the side edge with wrong sides facing each other. I sew the 2 side edges together with a straight stitch. Then I trim the seam allowance with my pinking shears. Next, I fold my skirt pieces over on the seam, press the seam allowance nice and flat, and then I stitch down the side edge once again to completely encase the raw edge within the seam. You can press the seam to the back to finish. And I repeat this for all of my side seams, sewing the skirt front to the 2 skirt sides, and then I'm going to sew the 2 skirt sides to my 2 skirt back pieces. I also like to give my skirt's center back edges a zigzag stitch to finish the raw edge. Next, I'm going to create a gathering stitch all along the top edge of my skirt. I set my machine to the longest length stitch and sew across the entire top edge of my skirt. Then I match my skirt to my bodice with right sides facing each other, and I match and pin the center front points together. I then begin gathering down the skirt's top edge so that it fits my bodice's bottom edge. I will pull the loose threads on either end of my gathering line of stitches and gently gather down my skirt so it's the same length as my bodice's bottom edge. I will gather down my skirt's top edge gently by massaging the gathers in place and working slowly and carefully, trying to keep the gathers evenly spaced. Now, because my fabric was so stiff and it had slubs and texture to it, it was very difficult to gather down using the gathering stitching I made with my machine. So I ended up switching to a needle and thread and gathering down the skirt's top edge by hand. I just cut a piece of thread a little longer than the bodice's bottom edge, and then I hand stitched through the entire top edge of the skirt to gather it all down by hand. I did my best to keep my stitching and gathers even, and I feel this method ended up working very well for me. For cotton fabric, I was able to use my machine, but for this faux silk, I found that the hand gathering was just easier and worked better. Once I gathered down the top edge of my skirt, I then pinned it to my bodice's bottom edge, again trying to keep everything even and symmetrical on both sides. And again, I want to keep those right sides facing each other. And here you can see the skirt gathered down and pinned to the bodice's bottom edge. Once everything was pinned, I then took it to the machine and stitched all along the waist edge, joining the bodice to the skirt. And as I stitched, I took care while sewing over top my gathers, making sure that they all sat nicely. Afterwards, I pressed the seam allowance up towards the bodice, and then I top stitched the seam allowance to the bodice. Now this top stitching is optional, but I decided it would make for a nice detail. And once the skirt has been sewn to the bodice, I am next going to add my zipper into the center back of my dress. First, I match up the center back edges of my dress and I pin them together with right sides facing each other. I take care to match key points like the neckline and waist seam together. And I'm going to start my pinning at the neckline, where the lining attaches to the bodice, and pin down to the bottom hem of my skirt. No need to pin the lining. I'm also going to use chalk or an extra pin to mark approximately where I want my zipper to end. After pinning, I'm going to sew the center back seam for my dress, starting at the neckline and sewing down to where I want my zipper to end with a long length basting stitch. At this point, I will then change to a regular length stitch and continue sewing from the zipper's end point to the very bottom edge of my dress. After I create this center back seam, I am then going to press the seam open. I will also press back the edge of my lining. It is in this center back seam I am going to position and pin my zipper in place. I want the zipper teeth facing the seam. After pinning, I like to hand baste the zipper in place. I find this makes it much easier to sew the zipper with the machine, and it prevents getting poked by all the pins. Hand basting the zipper is optional, but I think it really helps. After basting the zipper in place, I use my seam ripper to open up the back seam to the zipper's end point. This makes it much easier to sew either side of the zipper. Then, using my machine, I stitch the zipper in place, sewing up either side to secure it, and I recommend you switch to your zipper foot. Afterwards, you can remove any final basting stitches, and with that, my zipper has been added to the center back of my dress. Now I'm going to continue on and finish the inside of my dress. To do this, I'm just going to hand stitch the lining to the seam allowance of my bodice. I will fold in the seam allowance of my lining and match it to the inside of my bodice, pin it in place, and then hand sew it. I will do this all on the inside of my dress, along the center back by the zipper and the waist. I want to take care when hand sewing to only catch the seam allowance so that my stitching doesn't show through to the front. And I want to make sure that my hand stitching doesn't get too close to the zipper teeth. Now this can take a little bit of time, but I think it's well worth the effort, and it makes for such a lovely and tidy inside to your garment. And it protects any raw edges that would otherwise be exposed, so I do think it's well worth it. Next, I'm going to trim the bottom edge of my skirt with pinking shears, and then give it a simple rolled hem to finish that bottom edge. I just folded the bottom edge up twice to hide the raw edge, and then I stitched it down. I did this around the entire bottom edge circumference for my hem, but of course you could opt for a different finishing method or a different hem style. And I do recommend measuring and checking the length of your skirt when cutting out your pattern pieces to make sure it's long enough for both your height and desired hem. And for a final little detail, I decided to add a little trim to the waist and neckline of my dress. I just top stitched the trim in place and then folded the ends under to hide it. Now this pattern may have a few tricky bits. For myself, setting the sleeves in always takes a bit of care. But my hope is that this pattern will be a fun base for lots of amazing and creative dresses. I think it looks so cute when paired with corsets and capes and boots, and it really works well for different fabrics and embellishments. But with that, my dress is complete, and I'm very excited to share with you how it looks when worn. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos, then definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.